All right, you still there, Sarah?
I am still here.
Okay, here we go. Alan, do you know Alan?
Yes.
Everybody knows it.
Sarah,
This is
yeah.
conspiracy. I'm the only one who doesn't know anybody here. Let me just start off by saying, for Alan's sake, that as a teacher, I like questions. So don't hesitate by any means to interrupt politely at any point to ask a question that comes to mind when I'm saying something. You may not understand what I just said. Say so. So don't hesitate. The other thing in that context, which I like to do, is I like to start every session with a call for questions that may be in your mind from the last time we met, or they may have come up while you were thinking about what we said last time or what you were reading in preparation for this time. So let me start with that then. Are there any, for openers, are there any questions, concerns? There can't be any objections yet. Yes, Nancy.
Could you tell us something about the New Jerusalem Bible exactly compared to standard, whatever it's called, Revised Standard, and the various others that are around?
Well, I've used it for many years. It was originally recommended to me by my friend Frank Peters, who is a Christianity, Islam, Hebrew scholar at NYU, and he recommended it to me, and I find it to be true as a very good, if you want to call it, study Bible. In other words, the notes and the cross references are extremely handy. It's also the New Jerusalem Bible is a redoing of an original version that came out under the title The Jerusalem Bible, which was originally translated by a group of French scholars, and the New Jerusalem Bible is a redoing of that for English, where the English scholars went back to the original Hebrew and the Greek. So it's, I would say, generally an authoritative text, basically up to date with the current scholarship in that area. I can't really compare it to other versions because that's not my thing. Okay, so I'm really just saying that I find it useful and authoritative myself, and that's the reason I've recommended it for this course. Any other questions, concerns?
Not yet.
Not yet? Okay. Maybe what I will do is, before we get into the text, I will hand out. Sarah, do you have the handout from this morning?
Yes, I do.
Okay. This is a handout that I put together in preparation for this class, and it's probably the first page at least will give me the opportunity to make a kind of general introduction to how I see the New Testament and how I see it in relationship to the thinking now occurring and vice versa. And more substantively, even as my cute little parenthetical title, A Brief History of Freedom. I hope you recognize that that's a takeoff on Mr. Hawking's A Brief History of Time. A Brief History of Freedom. More substantively, in other words, this outline is a way of putting out succinctly what I understand to be the nature of reality, which understanding of the nature of reality is what is found in the thinking now occurring, which in turn, if you start with Novitas Mundi, you understand the thinking now occurring understands the nature of reality to be tied in with, historically, the incarnation. All right, so for openers, in other words, totally apart from the New Testament per se, or apart from this course, right? The thinking now occurring starts on the assumption, you might say, with the working assumption. It's more than that, what I call thinking now occurring light and heavy, all right? So thinking now occurring heavy is not just assuming the reality of the incarnation, it's understanding it to be the reality. But you could read Novitas Mundi in what I call the light mode. You could take the incarnation as an hypothesis which best explains the history of thought in the last 2,000 years. So either way you want to take it, the incarnation is central, let's put it that way, to understanding where the thinking is now occurring is coming from and what it understands to be the nature of reality. So as I found myself having the occasion to say to a friend of mine recently, when we were in a rather wide-ranging conversation, but somewhere in the conversation I had the opportunity to say to him, by way of distinguishing the thinking now occurring from, or by way of distinguishing the understanding of what is called the history of being, as it is as that term, history of being, which by the way is the part of the subtitle of Novitas Mundi. Novitas Mundi subtitle is Perception of the History of Being. And I was saying to my friend in a very different conversational context that as opposed to Heidegger, who probably, if not originated the notion of the history of being, certainly has put it on the map as an intellectual concept. The distinction, the short and simple distinction between Heidegger and the thinking now occurring when it comes to the notion of the history of being is that if you read, I don't know whether we were all in class together when we did Heidegger a year or so back. We did the Beiträge, where we all here with the exception of Alan and Sarah. But when you read the Beiträge or contributions to philosophy is the English translation of Heidegger, it becomes very clear that there is a history of being in Heidegger, but the history of being turns out to be, if I put it in terms of the Beiträge, it turns out to be a history of the relationship between being and Dasein, right? And the most immediate and current, as it were, feature of that relationship is what Heidegger calls the abandonment by being, or the abandonment of being, or the abandonment of Dasein by being, right? And that abandonment, of course, in Heidegger's view, is a fruitful, creative, positive moment, making possible the kind of resoluteness and the kind of awakening, in a Heideggerian sense, to the deepest nature of our being that we otherwise would be oblivious to if being had not abandoned us and left us, as it were, in the lurch. Now, I don't want to get into Heidegger immediately, but I just recall that general attitude of Heidegger's to contrast it with the thinking now occurring, and this relates to the notion of the incarnation, that in the thinking now occurring, the history of being does not connote the relationship. I don't say it excludes the relationship, okay, but it is not limited to a relationship between Dasein, between being here and or being there, or if you want to speak broadly, between the world and God or being. It's not simply a change in the relationship in the thinking now occurring, but it's a change in being, right? So in other words, being itself is not allergic to change as it continues to be. See, this would be the intellectual critique of Heidegger, that he does not escape for all his critique of the history of Western philosophy and metaphysics and the death of philosophy and the end of metaphysics and so forth. For all of that, he remains a modern. And a modern, the problem with modernity is, as I've said in different contexts from time to time, the problem with modernity is not that it went too far. The problem with modernity is it didn't go far enough. All right, it's self-anchored, it's self-restricted, and in that self-restrictedness and self-anchoring of modernity, if I translate that into traditional metaphysical terms, what it doesn't get rid of in hanging on, even in Heidegger, to a notion of owndom, right, which he plays on kingdom, owndom, selfdom, own, O-W-N, right, owndom, selfdom, a subjectivity, even if it's a primordial or originary owndom, it is nevertheless deeply connected with, but much to the chagrin of Heidegger, ought to be, much to his chagrin, deeply connected with the Platonic notion, the Greek notion, the classical notion, which we find still in Augustine, that God or being or what really is doesn't change. You see? So what I'm saying is the thinking now occurring, if you put it in the large intellectual landscape, is saying that being changes, that the history of being is not simply something, as it were, external to being in the way in which it's relating to something other than itself, or something that belongs to it, or to which it belongs, or to which it is related positively or negatively, but that history is, and I don't like the term, but I'll use it and then take it right back, as it were, it's internal to being, right? Change is, as it were, big as it were, big quotes, okay, around internal, but being changes without ceasing to be, without having any kind of notness in the sense of nothingness associated with it, right? Now, that issue of notness will come up as we go through the text of John, so I won't go off on that immediately. Okay.
Hi, Dave?
Yes, Sarah.
Sarah, did you just say notness, N-O-T?
Yes, notness, N-O-T-N-E-S-S. And what I'm distinguishing, the way something is not something in the thinking now occurring, from the way something is not thinking in all thinking up until now. The difference is that if all right, so I'll jump ahead. One of the disadvantages that Sarah and Alan are suffering under is that it's also their great good fortune, is that they haven't suffered through foundation. All right, Sarah has taken a course with me in Novitas Mundi, and Alan fortunately hasn't had to do any of this previously. But if you went through foundation, and especially section 3.1, which I call the logical chapter, in which I outline what I call real trinary logic, which I'll come back to in a moment. If you go through that, then and another, let me give you another reference for this notion that I'm putting on the table. The peculiar, specific notion of notness in the thinking now occurring. Perhaps instead of you could go to foundation, but if you went to Faith and Philosophy, the more recent book, there in several places in my treatment, especially of Kierkegaard, but elsewhere in that text, maybe in chapter 7, I make very explicit that the 0, unum, 1, the three digits, the three elements of the real trinary logic, can be understood as 0 equals not nothing, unum equals not nothing. If I'm going through too fast for you, Sarah, you just interrupt me and tell me to say it again. Don't hesitate. And 1 equals not nothing. Okay? To make the point I'm making now, if you look at 0 equals not nothing, and unum, which is the 0 with the line over it, equals not nothing, if we were thinking the way English grammar works, or if we were thinking the way modern philosophy works, most particularly, for example, if we were thinking in the most profound sense the way Hegel works, do you see, then that second not, the unum not, the not nothing, ought to return us to nothing. Right? So if I say that this is not nothing, and then I say, no, it's not nothing, you would expect that I'm asserting that it is still nothing, as it were, right? Or you see, or that first negation is being negated. The double negation in Hegel, in some sense, returns me to where I started. All right, so if I start with nothing and I double negate it in our normal way of thinking, when I say our normal way of thinking, the thinking that we've been doing for the last 2,000 or 3,000 years, if I say not, I'm back to where I started. If I start with nothing, I'm back to nothing. If I start with X, I'm back to X. Okay. In the thinking now occurring, the negation, the negative, right? There's still a negative, obviously, but the negative does not go backwards in that way. A double negation does not bring me back. The fundamental reason is, the most important fundamental reason is because there is no nothing. That all double negation, if it isn't, in this case it's explicit, right? When I say not nothing and then not nothing, I'm making it explicit. But if I say not X and not X, normally I would return to X. What I'm saying to you is that normal operation of the double negation is always implicitly an acknowledgement that there is some kind of nothingness that we're dealing with here, right? So if I suck out of my consciousness, right? If I suck out of my consciousness all nothingness, all nothingness, right? All nothing, right? There's no nothing. And I still want to say no. Okay, fine. You can say no, but if there's no nothing, every time you say no to something, you've got something else. You're not back where you started. Do you see? So negation in the thinking now occurring, it functions exclusively over against this other more common and historically conditioned notion. It functions exclusively as a mode of differentiation. You see? So unum is not zero, means it's something different than zero. And if zero in the thinking now occurring is not nothing, then not nothing is not nothing. And it's, you see, but see the problem? It's not nothing, but no, it's not. There ain't no nothing, right? So it ain't not nothing either. You see, it's not nothing. That's the way it is. It's okay. Yes.
So what happens if you insert or use the word creation at that point? That the negation is some kind of creation, right?
Well, if there's if your notion of creation involves a negation, do you see? But creation in the context of the thinking now occurring is creation ex nihilo. And the whole point of the ex nihilo, which is something that is pointed out by Thomas Aquinas, and very relevant to this discussion, because Thomas considers in the 13th century the question of what does it had become traditional by that point, right? Going back to the time of Augustine and upwards, all through the Middle Ages, from the late Classical age, it had become by the time of Aquinas in the 13th century, it had become just a matter of fact to refer to the creation in Latin as creatio ex nihilo, right? But he was aware, you see, of the temptation of the human psyche to take nothing seriously. That's a pun, you see. Right? We're so tempted to take nothing seriously. All right? But now skip. Bracket the pun. To take nothing as if it were something, do you see? As if, in this case, speaking technically now, because Thomas is as much of an Aristotelian you can be and still be a Christian. So he's not, strictly speaking, substantively, he's not an Aristotelian. He's formally an Aristotelian. He adapts Aristotelian categories of thinking and certain portions of Aristotle's understanding of the relationship between mind and nature that distinguished Aristotle from Plato. In those ways, Thomas is an Aristotelian, right? But ultimately, he can't be an Aristotelian because Aristotle presumes, as I've indicated in a different context a few moments ago, an eternal reality. If it's real, if it is, if it bees, you see, if it's an essence, it doesn't change. So as I've said in different contexts, If Aristotle had been around when Darwin published The Origin of Species, he wouldn't have had to open the book to realize, from an Aristotelian point of view, was nonsense. Because by definition, a species is just a biological equivalent through metaphysics of the Aristotelian notion of essence. And essences, species as such, don't have an origin for Aristotle. And they don't have an origin, and they don't change. See? Okay. To go back to Thomas Aquinas. So Thomas, understanding the how shall I say, the historical conditioning of our consciousness, but dealing with what he understood to be the explicit content of faith, namely that the world was created ex nihilo, he then considers, what does ex mean here? All right? Does it mean, and you can see in English it's ambiguous too, because our translation in English, whether we realize we're translating or not is another question, but we would say, and we do say, the world was created out of nothing. Out of, exit, it goes out, okay? So we say in English, as it says in Latin, the world was created out of nothing. So Thomas has to say, wait a minute, what shall we understand by out of here? Do we understand out of in the sense that now he doesn't use this analogy because it would have been ahistoric, anachronistic, but he might have used the analogy, does Michelangelo make or create, is it out of the way Michelangelo creates or makes the statue of Moses out of marble? You see, which in technical terms is out of referring to nothing as the material cause of the world. You see, is the world formed out of some kind of pre-existent nothingness? You see, that's the question he asks, and he answers it decisively. Right? No, that's the wrong understanding. Ex nihilo means after nothing, in the sense that prior to the first now, which would have given Aristotle conniptions, right? By definition in Aristotle, a now can't be the first now. There can't be a first now. Because the world is eternal, that's one reason. But the other reason, more technically, is that in Aristotle, every now is the end of a period of time and the beginning of a new period of time. So if I say to you now, okay, everything up until then, right? And then everything after that, everything since I said now, right? Okay, that's the way Aristotle is thinking, which seems to make perfect sense. Right? Okay, so Thomas says no, there is a first now. That's what we mean by Novitas Mundi, the newness of the world as an article of faith for Thomas now. For Thomas, it's an article of faith. What it means is that the world began without anything prior to it. So the nothing there is not substantive. It's not even material. You see, it's just. I'm tempted to say that the only reason you would misunderstand that is that you would retrospectively look prior to that first moment, of course, but there'd be nothing to look at. I mean, there wouldn't even be the absence of the world. You see what I'm saying? There'd be no absence of the world prior to the world. That's how radical the beginning is. You see? So we would say that the world was absent before it was created, but no, it wasn't. Because absence is just the corollary of presence. Right? So the world was neither present nor absent. There was nothing of any sort. And so the thinking now occurring is it wants to take that with absolute, utter intellectual seriousness. Since I brought up Thomas, I point out to you, which I've done on several occasions, but not everybody has heard this. In Thomas, he takes it seriously, but he takes it as a matter of faith as over against a matter of reason or science. All right? So when Thomas raises this issue, when he talks about the Novitas Mundi, he says, oh, by the way, I'm paraphrasing, he speaks much more formally. He says, by the way, don't make the mistake of trying to prove, by which he means demonstrate in the Aristotelian sense, which for Aristotle and Thomas was the equivalent. Don't try and show rationally or scientifically that the world began ex nihilo in this sense. He says it can't be done. You can't do it because you would need to abstract. For Thomas, to prove anything, you need a middle term that you in the syllogism and to get that middle term to prove that the world was created ex nihilo, you would need to be able to abstract from the world that essence, and you can't do it. Okay? Now, of course, there was no Husserl. There was no Husserl, right? But so it's impossible, rationally, scientifically, philosophically, if you want, any way you want to phrase it. You can't demonstrate it, says Thomas, but you can and you ought to believe it, right? Right? Okay. If you're a believing Christian, you ought to believe it, but just because you believe it doesn't mean you can, technically speaking, understand it, comprehend it technically, that is, logically, formally. Thinking now occurring is bold enough to say, well, that was true in the 13th century, but a lot of water has gone under the bridge or over the dam in the last several hundreds of years. And one of the unintended upshots of modern self-consciousness, bracketing its self-restrictedness, has been to clear away, as it were, something of the underbrush, something of the residual in thinking that was carried from the classical world into medieval Europe. Modernity has, as Descartes intended to, has in some sense started over with Descartes. You see, it has in some sense. Again, to make the point, the critique of the thinking now occurring of Descartes is not that he started, as it were, from scratch, but that he didn't scratch hard enough. Okay, this is a critique that the thinking now occurring shares, as far as it goes in Husserl, with Husserl, because Husserl was also a critic of Descartes for Descartes not being as thoroughgoing in his presuppositionalist understanding of consciousness as he ought to have been. So when I get to Husserl, when I get to phenomenology in the formal 20th century sense, I've got modernity's best attempt, you see, to clear away altogether all presuppositions, you see. But you see, again, to carry out the spirit of the same critique, but not quite. Why not? Because I've got this phenomenological landscape as the result of of bracketing my actual concrete, I want to say, existential experience. You see, I bracket it. I put it out of play, the substance or the existence of this world for Husserl, and then I can have my pure, unpresuppositioned consciousness. You see, but you get the point. That's the problem. All right. So another way of understanding thinking now occurring, it's as it were. Now, of course, the analogy breaks down here. But if you can imagine an absolute epoche, right, where there's no existing world put out of play. Now, put that positively. In the thinking now occurring, it's all about creating the world ex nihilo here and now. You see, you follow the drift of that logic. All right. That was all provoked by. All right. So I'm not even sure. I guess the direct answer to your question is I'm not sure that you need to bring in the question of negation.
Creativity. That was the question.
Yeah, immediately there.
Yeah. You used the word differentiation. Which
differentiation.
Which led me to creation somehow. They were connected. So
okay. But then, okay, that's good. I like that. So that would be, then I would have to say what we're talking about here is an absolute differentiation, analogous to a creation which is absolute in that sense that it absolutely presupposes, you see? I was going to say it absolutely presupposes nothing, but it's a game. The language is a trick. Okay, it just doesn't presuppose, period, is what creation ex nihilo means. So ironically, what we have in phenomenology is an attempt, right, again, hobbled by its historical tie to Descartes, the attempt to have the absolute negation of presupposition as the, I was going to say the starting point, but I want to say if you really had that, that starting point would be indistinguishable from the end point. The beginning and the end would be that point, which is the absolute now. To say so, the now, the absolute now, in that sense, puts. I'm speaking now metaphorically in contradiction to everything I've just said, so don't take it seriously. As it were, it puts out of play, but it doesn't just put out of play. For the thinking now occurring in the absolute now, there is no, in that absolute now, there is no past or future, to say. And that's where the logic that we've developed happily here as we went along, this is a kind of merrily going along, the thinking now occurring, we came upon somewhere along the line a year or so ago the notion that gets embedded in the text of Beyond Sovereignty, the notion of beyond X. All right. So beyond X gets rid of the need. I could put it that way. I had to reflect on this when I'm trying to prepare the text of John here. Beyond the notion of all right. So beyond X is that chair is on the other side of the table. So that chair is beyond the table. All right. The beyond X is saying that notion of distance, that notion of distancing, which, by the way, underlies the notion both of, first of all, obviously the notion of presence. Something is present to something else, right? Something is in front of it, before it. It implies some kind of distance. And then absence is just the negation of that, right? That where I would find something over against me over here, I don't find it. It's absent, right? And if I put it back, it's present to me. But there is that kind of beyond Xness, you see, again, like our other uncriticized notions of our experience, that kind of beyond Xness is everywhere in our thinking, what I call up until now our normal thinking, right? Okay, so in the thinking now occurring, so the future, for example, or the past for that matter, depending on the direction you're going in, would be beyond now. The future, it's easy with the future. But before now, beyond now, comes to the same thing logically, you see? So before and after in that sense, they vanish in the thinking now occurring because instead of, I can put it that way, I think, in lieu of the notion of a past or a future that is at a distance, as it were, I mean an ontological or psychological distance from now, I have this notion of beyond X. So that what otherwise would be understood in terms of some future framework, do you see, or some framework called the future, all right, can be, even in the absolute now, differentiated as something not in the future, but something, I'm forced to say, I could say no more or less, but maybe all I need to say, something different from something else, some other, which is, now, this absolute now, which is very difficult for me to get my hand on, right? I can't, where is it, right? Okay. But notice, even though I can't exactly put it in a box and take it home, if I could, it would be loaded with lots of different things. Do you see that? Right? So this, I think of the absolute now as absolutely thin, absolutely taking up no room at all. And yet, if I can have through the beyond X, differentiation within the absolute now, then that's, as it were, and again I speak loosely, all the room that I need. I have no more room than that, and I don't have any room like it outside of the absolute now. Okay. I think I better stop on that one, but it all wraps around. You'll see it all wraps around. I think the question you should have asked, but maybe I tipped it off with the syllabus, is why are we starting with the Gospel of John? Because the traditional order. Now, of course, you told me one time you were an atheist, so you're excused from having to know any of this. I
never studied the Bible.
Right. Okay. You've read the Bible or studied it, or?
I never studied it. I certainly read it.
Okay. All right. And so I think we're all more or less aware than you might even be aware that if you pick up the Bible, you don't, right? The traditional order of the Gospels is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And we're starting with John. And then if you read the introduction to the Gospel of John, which, by the way, I forgot to do. I have read it, but I wanted to reread it, and I forgot to do that. But when you read the introduction in here of the Gospel of John, you discover that it is understood by scholarship to be the latest of the four Gospels, the last of them, written somewhere around the year 100. There's a lot of, it could be 90, it could be 110, somewhere in that area. So somewhere maybe 60 or 70 years after the death of Jesus. So it's the last Gospel. There's no disputing that. The other obvious characteristic of the Gospel of John, if you read the other Gospels, which if you were a traditionalist, you would have done by the time you got to the Gospel of John. You would have started with Matthew and you would have read through. And when you get to John, you're in a very different world, so to speak. You're in a very different landscape, as it were, because if I put it a little crudely, but just to make the point, John's Gospel is, as it were, very theological. Right? It's very, in its own way, it's very intellectualized compared to the relatively concrete narratives of the other three Gospels. They have their differences, but they all, the so-called synoptics, because they follow basically the same plan of attack in describing Jesus' life and sayings and deeds, so that you can literally, synoptic, you can put them next to one another and you can see them operating more or less in a parallel form, although there are specific differences. Whereas you can't do that with John, right? So John's got his own plan of action, so to speak. And then I'm saying the tone is much more, I want to say, I have to be careful here, because it's very misleading. It's very misleading. But I'll say it's just to make the point so we can take it back. It's a little more ethereal, right? Now, he appears that way compared to the other Gospels, and yet modern archaeology in our lifetime, yours and mine, in the last 10, 20 years, has been digging up all over Jerusalem pools and porticos and stuff that they found by reading the Gospel of John. Okay, not the other three Gospels. That's the point I'm trying to make. So here you have this guy who's doing this very, as it were, in quotes, theological approach to Jesus, and yet his earthly references are very real and concrete, which we probably could not as fully appreciate 100 years ago as we do today. Which reminds me to say something else. Another guy I put on your reading list is Bultmann. And, are you familiar with the name of Bultmann?
Yeah.
Bultmann is a 20th century Protestant Lutheran theologian who made a major name for himself by being a theologian of what he called, although he had to keep explaining it, demythologizing. All right, so he wants to demythologize the New Testament. So Bultmann is not he's not a skeptic when it comes to faith. He's not a non-believer. Right? He's a quite serious believer in the truth of what is presented in the New Testament. What he feels, his basic impulse is to think now remember he died I think in the 60s, so he's been dead a while, but he's a thinker who is really at his peak in the middle of the 20th century. And what his concern is that the modern reader picking up the New Testament is going to be put off by what Bultmann takes to be the mythological way in which the truth of the New Testament is presented. The easiest form of that mythology would be the notion that God is in the heaven, where heaven means up in the sky someplace, higher up there, right? Now that's not going to comport with modern science, you see, and it wouldn't even at this stage of the game, even with the average man on the street, cannot think that there's anything up there except something above the stratosphere, which is, where we take off into outer space. So our whole picture, you see, of the world scientifically has changed from what it would have been 2,000 years ago at the time of Jesus, and before, for that matter. And so Bultmann is at pains to demythologize the text, right? So how are we to understand the truth of the New Testament without committing ourselves to a cosmology, among other things, that is out of date? And then there are other things related to that, right? So for example, the miracles of Jesus for him become legends, ways of conveying a truth that certainly need not be, and I think he thinks could not be taken literally by any modern person who wasn't willing, as he puts it, to sacrifice his intellect. To say, okay. So when the thinking now, and there's one other important thing about Bultmann to say. Well, two other things. The second one is, which is particularly relevant to the Gospel of John, is that Bultmann worked on the assumption that John's mythology. Gets complicated. I can't help this. You understand? I always have to excuse myself. This is not me. Life and thought is complicated. Okay. So when Bultmann takes this general approach and applies it to John in particular, he sees two things. He sees that John, number one, is also working within some kind of mythological framework, as everybody in his world would have been, by the way. I mean, it's not peculiar to the writers of the New Testament. That's not the point. Okay, the point is that that's the way people express themselves in that time in history. But we don't. Okay, all right. So when he looks at John, he sees that. He sees more particularly what he thinks he sees in John, the use of a very specific mythology in the background, namely the mythology of Gnosticism, which has become current in our time with the resurrection, if you'll pardon the expression, of the Gospel of Judas. All right, Gnosticism is an old heretical form of Christianity, which was relatively powerful for several hundreds of years during the early centuries of Christianity, and which was fought vigorously against by and suppressed, you would say, by the church as time went on. Now, modern scholarship, more modern scholarship since Bultmann does not support that thesis. And I also put on the reading list Ratzinger, Benedict XVI's book on Jesus of Nazareth, in which he points out and gives you some references to indicate that Bultmann's notion that Gnostic mythology was something that John was dealing with in his gospel is ahistorical. There is contemporary scriptural scholarship doesn't support Bultmann on that precise point. Okay. The other thing I want to say about Bultmann is that, and it just shows you how everything ties together, he was a Heideggerian. Okay. Now, he was a Heideggerian as a theologian. Right? It's like all ties of being a Hegelian. Right? That is to say, he adopted, or let's be fair, it's like Thomas being an Aristotelian. Is it? Okay. In the preface to Foundation, I say that the thinking now occurring understands the distinction between theology and philosophy to be passé, belongs to the past. I was about to say, therefore, aren't we glad that we don't even have the problem anymore, right? But when the distinction between theology and philosophy was operative, all right, what is unfortunate to notice is that the theologians had to keep borrowing understandings of things from the philosophers. Well, now, wait a minute. If you're just an ordinary, like if you're kind of, making up your own theology and you want to borrow some philosophical worldviews to support it, okay. But if your theology is that God, in the person of the Son, entered into history and saved mankind from otherwise absolute damnation, it's strange to think that your theology would even be tempted or need to or find useful support in Heidegger or Aristotle or whomever, right? You see, so thinking now recurring is saying, hey, guess what? We have now come to the point in history where what used to be distinguished as theology from philosophy, right, now is what it is to think in a way that the distinction between philosophy and theology is no longer operative, right? And therefore, it doesn't depend on, you say, Heidegger or Hegel or anyone else in order to understand this. We're going to try. This is a. You could call this a hypothesis or a thesis that we're trying to demonstrate over the next several months. It doesn't depend on these philosophical frameworks in order to understand the text. That it can understand the text immediately in the frame, if you want to call it a frame, of an essentially new form of consciousness, which now occurs for the first time in history. So that to think and to understand the text are now identical. That's what's being said here. But to go back to Bultmann, who, it should be said in his behalf, to whom the thinking now occurring was not available, he used Heidegger, okay, in order to understand how one should understand the New Testament. Right? Now, when he did that, he drew on the distinction. It goes back to the question I think you asked on day one when we opened up the Beiträge, is what does Heidegger mean between existential, E-double-L, and existential, A-L? And I'm not going down that path, right? But Bultmann is aware of the distinction in Heidegger, and he uses it this way, and it's basically Heideggerian. It's an oversimplification. That's what I said. Okay, but existential AL has to do with the categories, the categorical way of understanding our existence, where E-double-L is what Kierkegaard was talking about. It's not understanding our existence; it's existing. You see, it's the existential in the sense in which you and I as individuals exist. That's the existential, and the existential is the understanding of the truth of existentialism in the Kierkegaardian sense. That's rough, but it's like, all right. So what that means to Bultmann in the Heideggerian mode is that Bultmann wants to deny. So when he denies the truth of the mythology in which the New Testament is presented, what he's denying is what he would then call, a la Heidegger, the objective truth of the descriptions in the text, right? So if Jesus walks on the water, I'm not to take this as an objective, analogously objective scientific statement, to say, in the same way that Heidegger wants to distance himself from objective presence in the scientific sense, you see? And Bultmann may be a little more, I mean, he can afford to do it because he's a theologian. He's not a philosopher. He's not a thinker. He's not thinking in this sense. He's a thinker. You got to think to be a theologian, but he's not a thinker in the Heideggerian sense, right? Okay. So as a theologian, he can get away with this. His simplification, therefore, is that the way to read the text is existentially, E-double-L. It's to understand it as true for me. You see? By the way, profoundly Lutheran. I mean, after all those years, you see, Luther didn't have the scholarship, the world of scholarship that Bultmann was operating in. But ultimately, I mean, again, to oversimplify, but oversimplification is revealing sometimes, you see. It's ultimately and by the way, you see, it's not so strange when you stop and think about it. We don't emphasize it much, but when you read Kierkegaard, you're reading not only a guy who had, next to Hegel, perhaps the most far-reaching impact on the whole of late 19th and 20th century thought, right? But who, like Hegel, was a Lutheran. Okay. So if anybody tells you, it doesn't make any difference. No, it makes it makes all the difference in the world, you see. Not only what you believe, but how you believe. And this justifies all kinds of burning at the stake. So ideas count. Ideas make a difference in the world. Okay. So, but to go back to Bultmann and Luther, all right. So that Kierkegaardian existentialism is really operative in Bultmann, vigorously applied to the text, right? So I need to understand the truth of everything that's going on here, including the fundamental truth of the good news, of the advent of God in the world and the saving act of God. I have to understand that basically individually and existentially. And therefore, I have to be careful here because these things are complicated and complex and so forth, but fundamentally, Bultmann not only withdraws from the mythological cosmos, mythologically constituted cosmology of the ancient world, but I would say he really withdraws, in line with what I've just finished saying, from all cosmological understanding of the text. That is, putting it another way, and he's clear on this, while he says it's impossible for anybody in the modern context, given modern science, to have a view of the universe that's fundamental to this text, he is careful to recognize that even the modern scientific view of the world is, as it were, only, I'm not quoting him, but as it were, only relatively true. In other words, it's in some sense provisional. It's subject to modification and alteration, certainly in its particulars. You see? Okay. So he's not, so we want to be clear, he's not therefore saying down with ancient cosmology and the only that I should read the New Testament in terms of modern scientific cosmology. He's not saying that either, you see, because that would take him off the existentialist note that I'm trying to emphasize. So the difference between Bultmann, there were a couple of differences, obviously, which are implicit in what all I've been saying, but one of the differences is going to be that in the thinking now occurring, there is, unlike Bultmann, there's a radical critique in the thinking now occurring of modern consciousness, thoroughgoing, which therefore cannot but be either always implicitly and sometimes explicitly a critique of the foundations of modern science. You see, insofar as modern science is founded self-consciously, then regardless of what truth there is in it, just as regardless of what truth there is in Hegel or in Kierkegaard or whatever, there is a fundamental limitation which the thinking now occurring is calling into question. Right? Is saying belongs to the past, and the sooner the better. All right, so putting it positively, the thinking now occurring in talking about creating absolutely now as the absolute imperative, I almost want to say is doing the most radical critique of all possible cosmologies, both modern and ancient. To say that the world, the cosmos, if you want, is something that we are bringing into being absolutely ex nihilo, here and now, and just to be clear, by the grace of God, which will become clearer as we go along. Right? If I put that more technically in Beyond Sovereignty, what I wind up saying in Beyond Sovereignty, especially in section 3, is that the creature is, as a consequence of the incarnation, as it were, works itself out in the course of time, that the creature is, as a consequence of the incarnation, as it works itself out in the course of time, it is created omnipotence, right? So if God is omnipotence in the thinking now occurring, the best way to speak of God is omnipotence, then the creation is created omnipotence, if that were not clear, was not clear prior to this point in time and history, it is now clear for the first time. So that, okay. Now, that helps me then turn to the handout.
Well,
Yeah.
you were going to say, why start with John?
Thank you. You released that question because...
Well, it would come over here. It would go over.
Okay.
All right. Start with John because, go back to the logical, real trying to be logic, chapter, section 3.1 of Foundation. If you count 1, 2, 3, 4 in the logic, you count 4, 1, 2, 3. All right. In other words, you always begin with the fourth. All right. Now, if I put that in on the handout, for example, I just put this on here just to have it handy because it's available to everyone on page 4 of the handout. The index of the ethic of simplicity, which is in Beyond Sovereignty in section 2.2. You'll notice there I've set up these 4 dimensions, as I refer to them, on this index in the pattern, if you don't recognize it right off the bat, of the Cartesian coordinate system in 2 dimensions. All right, so if you look at Descartes' coordinate system, it begins in the upper right-hand corner is 1 for Descartes. It's 2 positives, 2 pluses in Descartes' logic, mathematics. You move over on the same level to 2, and that is you have a negative and a positive. You go down on that side to the 3rd box in Descartes now. You've got two negatives. You're on the left-hand side of the y-axis, and you're on the lower side of the x-axis. And when you come over back under where you started, you're in the 4th spot, and that is you now have retrieved one of your pluses because you're on the right side of the y-axis, but you're still got a minus with your plus because you're on the bottom side of the x-axis, right? So when you look at the ethic of simplicity, it's taken the same counterclockwise motion, but it's just grabbed hold of the Cartesian system and turned it 1/4 turn. So we don't start 1, 2, 3, 4, come back to 4, and then start over. We start 4, 1, 2, 3, and follow and start over with 4. Now, what's the significance of that? In the logic, if you use the logical digits, keep your eye on the ethic of simplicity. In 4D, in the top right-hand box, where I say after the space, real trinary logic element equals 1. If you compare that 1 with the 1 in the box below it, you'll see it's in bold. That's something, again, that as we went along over the last several years, I found useful to do to visually distinguish the 1 in the 4th box from the 1 in the 3rd box, 3D, right below it. And here's the difference. In real trinary logic, there are 3 digits that relate to one another in various ways, right? So, for example, 0 unum equals 1, 0 0 equals 1, unum unum equals 1, 1 1 equals 1. There are many others. You can find them in 3 1, but just to give you an example. When 0 unum equals 1, in the logic it's equaling the 1 in the 3D box. It's equaling the 1 that's like it. Okay, in other words, 0 unum and 1, that 1 is unbolded. It's regular type. But in box 4, you'll see the point. When 0 unum 1, when 0 unum 1 equals 1, the 1 that it equals is not one of the 3. See, it is the foundational unity of those 3, which, by the way, and I don't want to bend your head too far out of shape because it's not necessary to do that at the moment. but here's where Augustine is relevant, and Augustine's notion of the Trinity, which citations of which are placed in Foundation, in the appendix to Foundation. The three persons of the Trinity, Augustine makes clear over and over again, and I quote him verbatim in the appendix to Foundation. Each of those three persons taken one at a time, two at a time, or three at a time. Each of them equals or is the one God. So what you have in real trinary logic, which I discovered after the fact, happily, I like to do it that way. I don't like setups. What I discovered after the fact, that the real trinary logic, and that's why I put in the appendix from Augustine, is the logical explication of what Augustine takes him 15 years and 500 plus pages to articulate, right, around the four. See, it's great to be in the 21st century. There are certain advantages we have. Right? Augustine was breaking new ground. Right? So he understood the Trinity as the thinking now occurring, understands it, but he did not understand its full ramifications. He didn't understand that what we can see in the thinking now occurring as the logic of the Trinity is logic, is the logic of reality. Do you see? It's the logic in terms of which we can understand much more than we would think we could understand if we were to continue to think in the binary logic in one form or another. Forget there was no bull in 400 AD, but you understand what I'm saying. Wherever we have implicitly or explicitly a self-other reference, all right, a here and there reference, frame of reference, you see, wherever I have a kind of more or less ultimate binary setup, okay, I am limited in my understanding of the world in the way in which, according to Christianity, God understands the world. Because I'm sure, if God understands the world and he's a real trinary guy, he ain't going to bother thinking about it in binary terms. It'd be he'd have to have a self. That would be self-contradiction. He would be wary of doing that. You see? Okay. So, the one here is like the divine essence. It's not added on to the three persons. It's not another, as it were, another person, you see, or another thing, something other than what the three are individually and together. All right. So that's the point of that. Now, okay. So why? Okay. So now you see what a dumb question it is. Why start with John? Why start with the fourth gospel? Why start at the end? Well, why wouldn't you start at the beginning? The real beginning of the gospels is articulated in John. It's the last to be articulated, but what is articulated at last is foundational to understanding what's going on in the first three gospels. And this is not surprising. I mean, this is not unlike our experience, right? By the time we finally figure it out, it's too late. Okay. Now, fortunately for John, it wasn't quite too late. But in other words, it took a while to be able to articulate the life sayings and saving action of Jesus in the way in which he is able to do it at the time that he's able to do it. Now, I have an analogy to this, which I didn't do deliberately. In Faith and Philosophy. Is it Faith and Philosophy? No. It's in Beyond Sovereignty in section 1, not the preface, but section 1. I do a quick historical orientation, beginning with Christianity, and I speak of Christian Europe, modern American, all right, Christian European consciousness, modern European consciousness, modern American consciousness, and the thinking now occurring, which would be and this is not hard to find, the new global world in which we're in, okay? It's the last, you see, but it's foundational. It illuminates, right? It illuminates this, not only this text, but it illuminates history, right? Why does it illuminate history? Because it's essentially historical. Another little fine point here, which will become relevant, I think, when we try and go through the text of the New Testament. is that I put on this ethic of simplicity is chock full. I'm always tempted to add something to it. I've got all kinds of stuff in here, biological, physical references, and so forth. They're just little pointers, but it's handy to have it there because I have there somewhere toward the bottom of each box, about 4 or 5 lines up, exegetic analog. And what I'm referring there to is the fact that in the Middle Ages, there were 4 ways of understanding the text of the Bible. And I've given you them there in effect by aligning them with the aspects of the logic, right? And so I'm going to start with one because it's going to have greater impact. Okay. In box 1, I have the figurative or allegorical way of reading the text. Do you see? So I can read the story of Adam and Eve as an allegory. Right? I believe it, but I want to understand it as an allegory. I just want to. Maybe I'm a modern scientist. I'm into evolution. Right? So I got a problem. So as an allegory, I don't have any problem with it. Okay. So medievals were ahead of the time. They said, "Hey, you want to do allegory? Fine, let's do some allegory." Okay. But no, that's not enough. I'm Luther. You want to understand Luther in terms of the 4 moments of a proper medieval exegesis? Because remember, he was a medieval guy. We think, he was on the cusp of modernity. But his whole world, the world of which he was coming out of, he was sticking his first foot out into not only out of the monastery, you see, but into Hegelianism, right? And Kierkegaardianism and Bultmannianism and so forth. What Luther was coming out of, what he was coming out of was this world of these 4 ways of reading the text. And Luther is a tropologist. He's a moralist. Luther looks at the text and he says, and this is Bultmann, what is this to me? Right? You see? So what is the impact? How shall I read the text as a moral imperative or spiritual imperative on me? Right? The third way, traditional way, right? And you can see, I'm not going to go into it now because it's another course, another topic. Right? But I assume you can see the relevance of why I'm putting them in these boxes in terms of the ethical dispositions. Right? And then the third way, which corresponds to doing the right action in the ethics, is the spiritual. What is it called? Anagogical, right? I think.
Yeah.
All right, so anagogical is just a fancy Greek word which means to lead, and this is going to come up in today's reading already with Nicodemus. Ana, above, up, right? So the spiritual way is the speaking. Boltmann will forgive me. He'll understand, though. He'll understand. Speaking mythologically, the spiritual leads upwards, leads me up to heaven. You see, that's the idea. That's why it's spiritual. Leads me up from this world to the divine world. Right? That's the reason for the root of the word. All right. So I'm tempted to go off on the ethics, but I won't. Okay. The fourth one, which I saved for last, is the literal. But the literal meant the historical. What actually happened. Forget how I can apply that allegorically. Forget what it means to me. Forget what its valence is for me spiritually, what its spiritual message is. What actually happened? That's the historical. Okay? So now we got a problem, see? So John, what I'm saying by starting with John is that in John, contrary to expectations, I have the literal statement of the incarnation, you see? Which I couldn't understand to be literal if I were Bultmann or a modern, you see? Because my understanding of literal would be somehow that at odds with some kind of an alternative to an allegorical, moral, or spiritual. Do you see? But if the literal, actual reality permeates those other dimensions, you see, then I ought to start with it. Right? So now, of course, what do we mean by literal? Right? I mean, right? See, What do we mean by history? I'm not saying that we couldn't explore those at some length, and maybe we will. But that's the thrust of it. All right. So the short and simple answer is we're beginning with the fourth gospel because we're beginning at the beginning, and what we're beginning at is what actually really happened, which John makes clear. He makes explicit what is going on here in a way which, when we go to Mark, which we're going to go, Mark is number one, right, in the syllabus. He comes next because we're going around backwards on the perverted Cartesian squares. When we go from John to Mark, we're going to the least articulate, the least explicit, right? You got to, at the end of Mark, you look around. Was there a resurrection? Oh yeah. Right? But he doesn't hit you over the head with the resurrection. Right? It's right, much more muted. Whereas John, if you've read ahead at all, he'll hit you over the head. In fact, in today's reading, he hits you over the head with the resurrection. Right? Right. It's right there on page 1. You don't have to wait to the end of Jesus' life to get it. Right. So another thing, one of the critics, somebody, I forget who I was reading, points out that while John's gospel has a plan of its own, it's not a plan in which he's particularly worried about what we would understand to be a kind of chronological sequence of events or even of thoughts, you see. And if you buy my analysis here, that makes perfect sense, right? Foundationally, we're not doing 1, 2, 3. If 4 is where 1 is and 4 is where 2 is, or vice versa, where 2 and 1 are each of them at 4, and 3 is at 4, right? Then, while it's important to 1, 2, and 3 to make some sequential sense relative to one another, 4 doesn't give a damn. See? That's the fourth dimension. Right? Fourth dimension, we have an idea, but we've discussed that, right? The cube is 3-dimensional. It's easy. We can draw it. We can't. Everybody does. Dali draws it. I put his crucifix, which is the surface of the hypercube, but it's not. By which I mean to say, if that's the surface of the hypercube, you can see it's not the surface of the hypercube for a very, very simple reason. Where's the hypercube? If that's the surface, where is the volume of the hypercube? So we can't actually draw a hypercube. A hypercube would have a volume and a surface. If you tell me that I can draw you 8 cubes stacked like a crucifix, and that is the hypercube, you can tell me, no, it isn't. Obviously, it isn't. At best, it's a 3-dimensional representation of a 4-dimensional surface. Already, forget you think the thing. See, this makes thinking now occurring look relatively sane. I mean, what are we talking about? The surface of a 4-dimensional cube. A 4-dimensional cube surface has volume. Well, wait a minute. Right? It has something like the surface of a 4-dimensional cube is something like a 3-dimensional cube. Only it's 8 of them in the case of 4 dimensions, and it's 10 of them in the case of 5 dimensions, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So the point I'm making is looking at it another way. So I'm the 4th dimension. You guys are a cube. You're the edge. You've squared her, and you've deepened the thing. You're the 3rd dimension, right? Now, it's important for you, because what are you? You're the edge. To distinguish yourself from that guy, because he's a square, okay? And she's got it. She's got you both. She's got perspective on both of you, right? So she's the 3rd dimension. She's different, and those are important distinctions, right? But I'm the 4th dimension. It makes no difference to me at all. Just absolutely irrelevant to me. The distinctions but I'm not denying, as 4th dimension, I'm not denying the operative distinctions between 1, 2, and 3. I'm just saying, qua 4th dimension, I'm as close to you or as far from you, that is, I'm beyond X, when it comes to each of these 3 dimensions. You see? I'm beyond X. I'm what it is to be hyperdimensional. Okay. So John is hyperdimensional in that sense. He's 4th dimensional to the 3 Gospels that we'll read after him, and we'll read them in an order which is both roughly historical. Of course, we have all kinds of problems when you read the introductions. You can see, but it's pretty well established that Mark, even though he traditionally comes second, historically he's the most original, the closest to the source, so to speak. Then comes Matthew, then comes Luke. Okay, and so that works out very neatly, and that's why we're starting with John. Okay, now I still didn't get to page 1 here. So now I think it's only fair, and it's not just that I'm being fair, I'm also trying to give us something by way of, I keep being tempted today to use the word framework. You're awful quiet, Sarah. You still there?
Yes, I'm here. No, I'm doing great.
Okay. I was saying that I'm tempted to use the word framework. It's like everything else. We have these ways of speaking that are handy, but they're dangerous. So let me say, somewhere in my writing, I make the point that there are no more. In other words, there is for example, you can't understand Einstein unless you understand frameworks. You see, because he's saying that the speed of light travels at the same speed in all frameworks. You see? Otherwise, it wouldn't be a universal constant. All right? So, framework is an important concept in our mode of thinking, scientifically and otherwise, by the way, right? He's just making use of it, right? I mean, interesting enough, the thing I like about Einstein is that he discovered the reality of gravity in an elevator, right? Whether either literally or in his mind. Okay, in other words, gravity works the way what happens to you when the elevator falls through the shaft, right? Somebody cuts the wire and you're plummeting to your death, and what happens? You come up off the floor of the elevator, right? Now, if you didn't know you were on the way to the end, right, you say, hey, wow, this is great, right? And people even pay to go in airplanes, right? So when they go up high, and then what does the airplane do? It plummets you. You pay $1,000, $5,000, right, to float around in the air like you were in space. Okay, so Einstein, that's the basic principle that he thought. Hey, yeah, gravity's all a matter of acceleration. You see, and interesting things follow from that. The faster I go, the slower time goes. Right. So if somebody goes close to the speed of light on a trip in space and comes back, let's say a year later in that person's clock time, we may all be dead. It may have been 100 or 1,000 years. I mean, depending on how fast he's going. You see? Okay. So, but there's a constancy there. You see what I'm saying? In other words, the speed of light is constant. Otherwise, there'd be no return. Otherwise, I couldn't put the two different frameworks together. There's a common framework there in some sense, right? So what I'm saying somewhere in my writing is, I think it's probably in Novitas Mundi because it's very abstract, probably in the prolegomena or in the appendices. The thinking now occurring, there are no frameworks, just as there are no epoche in the strict sense of the word. Or if you want, okay, kind of a concession to be taken with a grain of salt, there's only one framework, and that's the thinking now occurring. I mean, so there might just as well not be any framework, right? Thinking doesn't have a framework in order to do its job, right? Or it's not limited by any pre-existent framework. That's another part of the notion that we are, as created omnipotence, thinking ex nihilo. Omnipotence ex nihilo, we're creating ex nihilo. Because if I were not creating ex nihilo, another way to put it in using this language, is that I'd be creating within a certain framework. You see? So there's no framework, because the framework is just an abstract way of talking about the potentiality, the material condition within which I would create something that did not exist prior to the moment of its being created. All right. So I was going to say, all of which is just allows me to say more generally, when I look at page 1 of the handout, what I'm presenting to you is, as it were then, okay, a framework in terms of which we can understand what is going on here. The framework is, as the title, the history of being, to create. And in effect, we've already touched on that. I didn't mean to do that, but I've already done a kind of quick exegesis of those terms, and then a brief history of freedom, by which I mean to suggest that the 4 divisions following on the page constitute something of a history. But then again, notice this history, if I take seriously everything I've said already, the history, it'll be a little misleading if I said the history is to go from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, when even though there's some truth in that, as we'll see, I hope, nevertheless, 4 is foundational. Nevertheless, 4 illuminates, explains. It is equally close to or far from 1, 2, and 3. So as far as 4 goes, it's a matter of indifference, as it were, whether we're at stage 1, stage 2, or stage 3. Nancy?
No, I just was getting something.
Oh, I thought?
Yeah,
okay.
no.
Well, you're getting something to look like you were going to ask a question. Okay. All right, so now to zero in a little... All right, so then you'll notice I have the logical digits to reinforce that particular relationship put in after the 1, 2, and 3. I was tempted, but then I thought, no, I won't. But I mean, I could have, but it just would have been pushing it. I could have literally started the page with 4. But it wouldn't allow me to do what I want to do now. Because what I want to do now is I want to take a more pedestrian approach to this and say that stage 1, the incarnate Word born and crucified, and stage 2, the incarnate Word resurrected, that's what we're going to find in the text, right? In the New Testament, we're going to have the story of the birth, death, and resurrection of Jesus in the New Testament. That's going to be in the text, okay? And we're going to have the beginnings in the text when we get, if it's not clear to you right away, when we get to Acts, the Acts of the Apostles, we're going to have the beginning of the church. So we're going to have the beginning of the very explicit and positive impact of that death and resurrection on people standing around, okay, on other people, on society, on the world at large. It begins small. You know, one of Chuck's questions was, and seconded by Alan early on. Alan Lobel is Adam. Pardon me. Well, who else is doing this thinking? Things start small. No one else was doing what Descartes did, right? And Jesus and these 12 jerks walking around in Palestine didn't seem like a very impressive lot, okay? Okay, so you can't go by that. You just can't go by that, right? But what I want to say is that even in the New Testament, even this relatively small group of people doing something completely off the wall, you want to talk about not being intelligible, right? Talking to people who were saying, what? Say that again, right? They had an impact, right? So the New Testament covers those two. So I've captured that here. Now I'm explaining something. All right, so here's where the thinking now occurring comes in. The thinking now occurring is making the distinction of 1 and 2 here by saying that, pointing out, which by the way you'll see when we go through the text, especially in John, but elsewhere too. This is supported by the text, all right? But I'm making very explicit here that when I go from 0 doesn't equal nothing, 0 equals not nothing, to the unum phase, to the phase of discretion in terms of the logical, of the ethical disposition of discretion, the second dimension in ethics, that discretionary stage is the stage of the Spirit. That's the stage that begins with Pentecost. That's the stage at which what Jesus promises the disciples before his death and ascension occurs at Pentecost. That is, he's going away, he'll tell us, but he's going to send the Spirit, right? And you'll notice on the ethical the ethical index, the Spirit is in the 2-dimension box. He's in the box of discretion, the box of hope, right? The box of militancy, I don't know whether we fully appreciate it, but the early church was it's a military outfit. It wasn't, as the Muslims are militant, it wasn't with the sword, physical sword, but it was a spiritual militancy, and they organized and understood themselves that way. The reason there was a hierarchy, and there were bishops who said, line up and march in that direction. Do this and don't do that. This is what the field manual says. Memorize it and come back tomorrow. And if you do, you pass and you get promoted, right? In other words, the development of dogma, the development of a uniform liturgy, and all of that stuff was what would naturally transpire if you had a militant group that was operating not militarily in the pedestrian sense of the word, but spiritually, all right? So it was a spiritual army, and that's the work of the Spirit in history, all right? The beginnings of which we see in the New Testament. So I'm saying at that point here, so again, phase 1, stage 1, the incarnate word born and crucified, and this is, I'm really quoting Jesus here. I don't put it in quotes because we'll have ample place to find it in John and elsewhere. Jesus says, I am in the Father and the Father is in me. And before he gets through here saying goodbye to his guys, he says, I want you to be in me and I will be in you, just as the Father is in me and I am in him. Okay? So I've just put that into the terms of the thinking now occurring. In other words, I'm just translating what Jesus says when he says that into terms that we can understand in the thinking now occurring. You will find I came up with this notion of embodiment, of which this is the symbol here. You notice what that symbol is, depending how you're looking at it, but if you turn it on its side, you'll see it's a little stick figure. All right. So it substitutes for the set theory symbol, which is a horseshoe on its side. Right? You know what a horseshoe is, right? When you play bouquet, that's the kind of horseshoe I mean. All right. So that symbol in set theory, and this is where I came up with this notion when I was doing my critique of Bad Jew, is included. All right. So in set theory, something is included in something else, or not included. Okay? But the U on its side is the symbol of that being included. If you reverse it, it's including something else. And I do the same on a later page, on page 3, I reverse the symbol. So the way I've got the symbol set up here, if you read that first, Jesus is embodied in the Father, and the Father is embodied in Jesus. That's the thinking now occurring specification of what in means when Jesus says that. Okay? By which I mean to say, so I say it right off the bat, Jesus doesn't mean when he says he's in the Father that he's contained in the Father. Do you see the point? He doesn't mean, and that's, you read these very innocent, there are so many beautiful things written, exegesis of the New Testament, right? By believing, intelligent theologians and others, and they have no problem talking about Jesus being in the interior of the Father. Well, fine, if he had one. You see what I'm saying? Okay. How can we have... See, Bultmann should like this as far as it goes, right? Bultmann says, by the way, that John and Paul have already begun, within the New Testament, they've already begun, says Bultmann, to demythologize the message, right? In other words, they're very conscious of the inadequacy of their own mythological framework and language to adequately describe the act of salvation. So Bultmann uses that understanding of Paul and John to justify his work. If they can do it, hey, we should do it. That's his attitude. I'm saying, okay, let's really do it, right? So Jesus in the Father, he can't be inside him. He can't be contained in the Father, right? The relationship between the three persons of the Trinity is not one of containment or jumping out of the box, right? It's not one of beyond X. Okay. So this is not I think this is neither an arbitrary nor whimsical, although it might strike you as the symbolism. I think it's cute. embodied in, the symbol embodied, we need it. We need it in order to think clearly about what's going on in the New Testament and what's going on at this point in history.
So I do have a question.
Okay.
I mean, maybe I've just lost something here.
Yep.
So to say the Father is embodied in Jesus, in some conventional sense, I understand, but Jesus is embodied in the Father. Help me with that.
Well, he says he is in the Father.
Yeah, but embodied.
Ah, okay.
So it's the word embodied.
Right, excellent.
Going that direction.
Right. Because we have, in the thinking now occurring, therefore we have to have an understanding of body. I'm almost tempted to say, I have to be careful here, but in some sense, I think I can do this and be legitimate. Our understanding of body in the thinking now occurring has to be essentially glorified body. It has to be, I don't mean simply, all right, because otherwise we wouldn't have to go through, even on paper, these 4 stages, all right? But there's a sense in the thinking now occurring. If there is no simple beyond X, there can't be any way of understanding the body as a container, even though we're tempted to do so. You see, because I eat the hamburger, and as far as the hamburger is concerned, it's contained in my stomach for a time, you see, until it is taken apart and partially excreted and partially assimilated to my body. Okay, so I'm saying in our everyday way of looking at the body, we have very good reason, uncritically, to think of the body as containing the hamburger, right? The problem with that is that where is the body that's containing the hamburger? It's in the room. Where's the room? It's in the building. Where's the building? It's in the city. Where's the city? It's in the country. Where's the country? See, it's in North America. Where's North America? It's on the earth. Where's the earth? It's in the solar system. Where's the solar? Okay? Well, that containment idea isn't going to get me very far, you see, because it goes off into infinity. Okay? So if I want to not be, see, now of course when I eat my hamburger, I don't worry about it. I just eat my hamburger. But if I were to think about what's going on, I get indigestion. You see? I would get indigestion. Because if I were to stop and think about what's going on here, what the heck is going on here? What is this body? What, right? I would be taken off into a kind of what Hegel would understand to be a bad infinity. You see? Now Hegel solves his problem by positing that God, what he calls the absolute idea, the absolute syllogism, his trinity that reduces to one, simply to one, is absolute self-enclosedness. Translate, the absolute container. You see? And he's right. He is, Aristotle, more deeply determined. In other words, it's the modern equivalent of the unmoved mover. Do you see? But you look at the heavy price I pay, both in Aristotle and in Hegel, the heavy intellectual price I pay for having an unmoved mover. In Aristotle, it's very clear, the unmoved mover, one thing he can't do is not only create a world, which comes to the same thing, he can't even think about a world. Because it would rattle him. He would have, right? He has no room for difference. He has no room for otherness. You see? So while he's perfectly still and undisturbed, you see, everything else is outside of him and unknowingly outside of him. You see? Controlled by him essentially mechanically. You see? Okay. I could do the similar thing with Hegel, but you get the point, and that's all I need to say on that, I think. All right, so the body is whatever the body is, and the thinking now occurring. It is not adequately understood ontologically as a container, no more, because there are no containers, because reality is not a question of containment or exclusion, right? It's not a question of inside or out. Right? Yeah, okay. All right, so Jesus, whatever it means, in other words, whatever a body is embodied in the Father, and likewise the Father is embodied in Jesus. And by the way, if you think about it just logically, getting rid of the notion of a container certainly makes it easier to understand that where there is a container, and I tell you I'm in you and you're in me, that creates a kind of complicated situation. Do you see what I mean? Because I start thinking about yin and yang, and and I'm going around there, and I got black and white, and where do they meet? I've got those two poles, and then they kind of inside and outside of one another. Do you see? And that gives us what? It gives us our infinity sign in mathematics, right? To which there is no end. Now, if there's anything clear in the New Testament, there is. May not be beyond X in the thinking now occurring, and it may not be beyond X in the beginning, and it may not be beyond X in the future, but there is a beginning and end in the thinking now occurring and in the New Testament. There is a creation, and there is an end of the world. You see? And that comes up in today's reading. The resurrection, which the woman at the well is expecting, Jesus says to her, this resurrection you're expecting, which is coming, he says it's coming. Indeed, it's already here. It's me. I'm talking. I'm it. Do you see? But notice he doesn't say. He could have. Why not? He was making it up as he went along, right? He could have said, "You're expecting the resurrection? Well, I got news for you. There's no resurrection to be expected. It's happening now." He doesn't say that. That'd be too easy. Would have gotten us off the hook, though, because then we could say, well, yes or no. You see what I'm saying? It'd be simple. He could have simplified it. But he doesn't simplify it because he's not thinking. He doesn't come from a world of containers. You see? The Trinity is not a matter of containing. Right? So he doesn't say that because I am here now, there's nothing to the notion that I am coming, or that the resurrection is here now and you're... See, watch this. It's impossible. I'm tempted to say in your presence. Very suspect, you see. Because the resurrection is here now doesn't mean that it isn't coming. So what could that possibly mean? That's the question. Fortunately, after a few years of doing the thinking now occurring, we have a clue. We have a hint that is not an accidental, that's not a contradiction, see, as it would be in self-consciousness, right, in container thinking. All right, so the third stage on this handout, the incarnate word resurrected, thought in essence for the first time. That's where we're at now. So what I'm saying, that stage as such, to the extent to which, remember, fourthness relativizes this distinction, but to the extent to which 1, 2, and 3 are like edge, square, and cube, then thirdness is where we're at now, and the intelligibility, the essential intelligibility of the text actually occurs now for the first time. Right? That's that. Right? And what I love doing this, because every time I think, and I try not to do it, don't tell Zarina, and I try not to think any more than I have to. Every time I think, I discover something, because the thinking is now occurring. And what I discovered when I started down this page, the logic compelled. See, the first two are easy. Well, they're easy if you do the thinking now occurring and you read the New Testament carefully. You can find support for that in the New Testament. Stage 2 begins at Pentecost, right? Jesus sends the Spirit. The church is enlivened by the Spirit, the flames come down on their heads, and so forth and so on. So there's support for that. The third stage, what I'm saying, is that's the thinking now occurring. That took 2,000 years. That's where we're at now. And what I say about that intellectually is that, and I've said it already in effect earlier on, is thinking now occurring is an essentially new form of thought. An essentially new form of thought means that we can now think what previously we could believe, but in believing we thought we couldn't think, as it were now, at the same time. That our thinking it and our believing it were not identically one and the same thing. So that, I'm saying, is a new development. When I follow the logic out of stage 1 and 2 here, I had no choice but to put down Jesus is now, for the first time, not embodied in the Father, because after his crucifixion and resurrection, what did he do? He went back to the Father. If you read, the relevant passage here is in Foundation 5:3, toward the end of the book. In the last chapter, I first articulate the notion that the Son, that sharing and having are to be distinguished in the case of the relationship between the Father and the Son, insofar as when the Son shares the Father, he doesn't have the Spirit. If you apply that to the life of Jesus, Jesus is sharing the Father. When he comes on earth, one of the things that should strike you, especially in our modern Protestant Christocentric consciousness, I mean, to the extent to which we have any consciousness of Christ, but if you have any in the modern world, it's very Christocentric. Whereas when you read John, what we call Christ, and which he calls Christ, keeps talking about Dad. He keeps talking about the Father. You see what I'm saying? If you were to say to him, hey, you're it, man, he says, no, don't misunderstand. I only do what I see the Father doing. I don't do anything. This is all the work of the Father. In fact, you're not even attracted to me unless the Father is drawing you to me. I'm not drawing you to me. You understand? Now you see how inadequate it would be to say that how self-effacing he is. He's not self-effacing. He hasn't got any self. There ain't no self here. I'm sorry. It doesn't exist. It just hasn't occurred to him anyway. Okay? All right. So embodied. So I was saying in Foundation, I first articulate this. When Jesus shares the Father, he has the Spirit. Then when he goes back to the Father, he now is not sharing the Father. He has the Father then. You see? And who's sharing what then? Then the Spirit is sharing the Jesus who has the Father, which I think I pretty much captured here. But I don't want to go over the details of that. I just want to give you the main idea. So if you buy the notion that in stage 1, up to and including the crucifixion, Jesus is sharing the Father but does not have the Father, I put in the parentheses there, which is an idea developed in section 3 at great length, the last part of section 3. When I talk about created omnipotence, I say that creation is lacking to the Creator. And then to distinguish it from all thinking that begins with an uncritical notion of nothingness and the nothing, and which applies to our friend Heidegger, who speaks of the creative hollowness of the jug. You remember that? The jug in Heidegger and the Beiträger, the hollowness brings forth, or I don't know, I forget the exact verb, but brings forth, forms the jug around it, and vice versa. You see? So if Heidegger were doing inside and outside Jesus and the Father, for Heidegger it would be like the hollow and the jug, and one would form the other, and the other would form the other. You know what I'm saying? And by the way, Heidegger, was a Catholic before he became a Protestant, before he became Heidegger. Okay, so there's a deep theological analog, at least in Heidegger. He says he's not doing theology, but certainly he's got the framework in his bones, you see. And if I were to theologize Heidegger, which I'm not about to do, I'm not Altizer, I wouldn't do that. Right? If I were to theologize Heidegger, then I would have to say he's doing inside and outside. Only he's doing it in an originary way. Do you see? He's doing it in an originary way. All right, so there's no inside and outside. So what I discovered, all right, is that if in stage one, so that's sharing and having. Applied more, fleshed out here, and in our reading of John is going to be this. That when Jesus returns to the Father, he stops sharing the Father. He's done his job. He now has the Father. He's back on. Hey, Dad, how you doing? Where you been? Okay, sit down. Let's have a cup of coffee. Right. Meantime, the Spirit is out there. They don't have the Spirit. The Spirit is gone. He's taken over his job. He's out there sharing this event with the world. You see that? Okay. So in stage 2, we got Jesus sharing the Spirit. All right, and the Spirit sharing Jesus. All right, but in both stage 1 and 2, when you're doing the sharing, whether you're sharing the Father or sharing the Spirit, you are engaged in a relationship with Father and or Spirit, which is characterized here as properly lacking, or I'm now specifying that not having. If I share, I don't have, and if I have, I don't share when I'm doing it. What I'm saying here is I can now flesh out what having means here better, more explicitly in the language of beyond sovereignty, that to have is, let me put it in the negative, it's clearer. Not to have is to lack. If I don't have the Father, I lack the Father, you would say. But if I'm thinking self-consciously, either in an ordinary or in an originary way, I think that to lack something is a deficiency. But to lack where there's no nothing is just to differentiate in an important and significant operational way, I want to say. Right? One thing from another. So in that sense, the Spirit is lacked to the Father and Son, who now have each other, because the Spirit now is doing its specific, absolutely specific work or function. And in that sense, Jesus sharing the Spirit, as I say in stage 2, and the Spirit not having each other. Alan, is your hand going up?
No.
Okay. Okay. I want to get back to stage 3 because I want to position what we're going to do here in terms of what I understand its relationship to, what I understand the relationship of the thinking now occurring to be to the New Testament and what ensues from the New Testament, and that is the thinking now occurring is stage 3, where, here's what I discovered, whereas in stage 1 and 2, respectively, Jesus is embodied in the Father and embodied in the Spirit. Jesus is now embodied in the Word. And I thought to myself, that's right, that's got, one thing Badiou, what I like about Badiou, setting aside the fact that he's still got modernity as a starting place, he's taking one more step. What attracts me to him is the rigor of his thinking. And that in turn is what attracts him to mathematics. That in turn is what attracts Badiou to set theory. Right? And one of the things he likes about set theory and mathematics, and you could say the kind of logic that Russell and people were doing, out of which came the contemporary notion of set theory, is its rigor. In other words, one of the points of, what is the word I'm looking for? Symbolic logic, I think that's it. If you've got your symbolic logic and you know the rules, then if you put this together with that, there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. This is what's going to come out. Okay? In other words, that's the rigor of it, and it really doesn't depend on whether you like it or not, or what you think about it, or it almost doesn't depend, in fact, I think essentially doesn't depend on what these symbols, what the content is. If the symbols relate to one another in such and such a way, that's it. Okay. Well, analogously, I don't say exactly the same because I deny the distinction between content and form in the thinking now occurring. So just as embodiment replaces containment. So analogously, you see, the indistinguishability of content and form in the thinking now occurring replaces the distinction of form and content, inside and outside, container and contained, that you find in set theory. However, having said all of that, there's an analogous rigor here, because while the real trinary logic is weird, while 0 equals 1 and unum equals 1, and why should that be? While that, nevertheless, there is a set of rules, right? So there's a limit, as it were, on what I can do, right? In other words, if I follow the logic a certain distance and I remain consistent with that inconsistent logic, to be more explicit about the situation, then it's going to tell me something I hadn't noticed before. What it tells me here is that where we're at now, when I talk about an essentially new form of thought, in these terms historically, right? When Jesus walked on the earth, he was embodied in the Father. When he left the earth and the church began with the Spirit's infusion, sharing him, he was embodied in the Spirit. And now he's embodied in the Word, which then I thought to myself, well, what does that mean? That's got to be the case. What does it mean? And then finally, after a day or two, because I'm really slow, I told you that before, I'm very slow, it dawned on me, well, of course, because in Beyond Sovereignty, in the 3:3, at the beginning, where Gauman is talking about defecating in paradise and all that crap, I bring up Thomas Aquinas because he brings him up. See, I wait. I didn't bring him up. Gauman brings up Thomas. I say, okay, you brought up Thomas. Let's take a look at Thomas in the light of the thinking now occurring. And Thomas makes a distinction analogous. It's only an analogy, see, but it's illustrative. He makes a general distinction between faith and knowledge. Thomas does, or faith and reason, faith and science, we might say. They go together. They're not in opposition. It's not Kierkegaard. Right? It's not Boltzmann. It's certainly not Luther. Right? But there is a distinction in Thomas. And you could say that one doesn't replace the other. Analogously in Thomas, and I quote him in Beyond Sovereignty in 3:3, in God there is a simple intellect, simplicis, and then there's a intellect visionis, of vision. And what he says is that Christ, meaning the incarnate Word, as incarnate in the flesh, says Thomas in the 13th century, shared, of course he was God, you understand, that's the whole, otherwise we wouldn't have a problem. We'd have nothing to talk about. Right? So this incarnate divinity, divine person, one with the Father and the one God, had to have some kind of divine knowledge, says Thomas. And he did. He had the same knowledge that the Father had, for that matter. He was the knowledge of the Father. But qua man, says Thomas, he only had the Father's, I forget the phrase he uses, probably intellectus visionis. If it is intellect, it's something else. Right? Good. I think that's it. He only had the intellect of vision, or maybe he says cognitio, I don't know, of vision. Right? So qua man, he has in part the knowledge of the Father. You see? And what I'm saying here is, so what this means here concretely in terms of what's articulated in Beyond Sovereignty, Jesus' embodiment in the Word for the first time, as it were, you see, is the, I'm going to use just clumsy language just to get the thrust of it out, is the overcoming of that Thomistic distinction. In other words, now, insofar as creation is embodied in the resurrected Christ, creation and man, given his peculiar role in the creation, has the mind of Christ, and Christ's mind can be understood not to be compartmentalized in the distinction between simple divine intellect and vision intellect. right? That the distinction between the simplicity of the divine intellect and what the intellect knows by vision is a distinction that falls as soon as we go from beyond X to beyond X. As soon as the distinction between simplicity and complexity is no longer intelligible. You see, as long as the absolute now has not only the room for the multiplicity previously designated as before and after, past and future, but has the room for every difference, is embodied you see, in the absolute now. And another way of putting that, which I think I use frequently in Foundation, is that what we're dealing with here is the absolute complexity of simplicity, right? Or the absolute complexity of an absolute simplicity. All right, so that Jesus is now, for the first time, embodied in the Word. The Word, if you mean by the Word here the eternal Word, that is the Word in the Godhead. You see how these categories are getting tough. They're getting tough. But I'm trying to bridge between traditional thinking. If I mean the Word prior to the incarnation, you understand how suspect that is already? If I mean that Word not yet embodied, as it were, right? That Word now is that in which the incarnate Word is embodied, and therefore that Word is embodied in the incarnate Word. That Word shares itself, as it were, with the incarnate Word, right? So, in other words, the distinction between the inside and the outside, the simple and the vision, is obliterated now by this, if you want, third movement. All right, that's what I'm saying in that, in effect, in that shorthand, and that corresponds to the term which I put at the end of that third section, created omnipotence. All right, so we now come into a fullness of understanding, where understanding and power, all right, are no longer distinguished. You see, where if we understand God through Jesus, in and through Jesus, now for the first time, with a clarity that we did not previously understand, we owe that to the incarnation just as much as the everything else previous to this is owed to the incarnation in one way or another, right? But what we now owe to the incarnation is not only a gift of understanding, which is an empowerment to do, to act, to create the world. Yeah, right. I want to say, well, you see, this is the really fine line. This is why Lucifer. Lucifer was not stupid. You know that. You know that Lucifer. Again, I have to ask Boltmann for his indulgence here. Right? Lucifer was the chief of the angels. He was the light bearer. That's what it means in Latin. Lux. He was the bearer of the light, meaning he was the most intelligent. He was the most alive. Right? Next thing, he was the supreme creature. So when he said to Eve, "Hey, you know why he doesn't want you to eat the apple, don't you?" And she said, "No, why? If you eat the apple, you're going to be like gods." Now you see, there's no better lie than a half-truth. So the truth, why was that believable? Right? It's very interesting. Why would you believe that if you were Eve? Why would you be tempted by that? Right? There must have been some truth in it. The truth is that we are intended to be, I'm going to speak in Augustinian language, right? We're intended to be one with God. We're intended to be divine, to become gods. Now, to become God, as I pointed out in another context, for Augustine, is not the same thing as to be God. The difference between us and God, when we're face to face with God in eternal bliss, is we're both going to be divine. The only difference is going to be we became divine by the free gift of God. He didn't become God. God is God. We become divine, however. We become gods. Now that's tempting, see, especially if you're impatient. Well, let's do it ourselves. Let's go. Right? Okay, and that's modernity. Right? So there's a lot of truth behind modernity. I mean, the power unleashed in modern consciousness, in Descartes' appropriation of what I call the transcendental essence, transcendental form of natural reason in Thomas. Right? That's not an accident. You know what I'm saying? The fact that we can blow the earth to smithereens today, we could actually do that. You know, if we put our mind to it, it wouldn't take a couple of weeks. Is not an accident. Okay? In other words, in understanding, in thought, there is power, right, to affect things, to do, to act. Right? So what I'm saying is that what we have in modern thought is a kind of effigy of the true situation. You see, we have a kind of a mock image of the ultimate implications of the incarnation, which are to bring us into a place where we could say quite legitimately, we are as God is, in this case, omnipotent creators, but not apart from the reception of that gift from God. In other words, we become gods as a matter of gift, as a matter of what I call on the index and elsewhere, productive receptivity, right? Which also, by the way, which I won't go into now, is a two-way street. But I want to get to the text, believe it or not. All right. So, section 4, which I won't dwell on now, new heaven and new earth, that we're going to find laid out explicitly, of course, in the Apocalypse, the last book of the New Testament. And what I'm saying, going back to my critique of the notion of past and future, that new heaven and new earth, that resurrection, as distinguished from the resurrection of the man Jesus, right? Speaking to the woman at the well, that resurrection at the end of the world, as we think of it, is distinguished in the absolute now of creating. It's distinguished from something which it is not, which we can put a knot. Start with one and put a knot next to it, and you got the other one. Okay, but there's no distance between them. Right? Whatever that differentiation is, it's not the kind of difference that we have to kind of wait around for. And this you'll see in Paul, right? And Bultmann points this out in Paul, right? Paul talks about a new creation, but he's very clear. Paul's very clear. The new creation has already started. Right? It's not something we're looking forward to in a simple sense. All right, I'm just going to stop there, and let's turn to the text of John, which in our text is on page 1744.
I have it in my text too, just a different number.
Okay, yeah. You have the same translation, a different edition, is that it, or a different translation?
I have the same translation.
In a different edition, without all the notes.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so then we have the famous, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. So if you look on page 2 of the handout, I'm going to skip over the top part of page 2 because it'll just take me backwards. You can think on it, and we may bring it up. In page 2 of the handout, a little ways down under John 1:1, I do there what I do to Augustine's text in the appendix to Foundation. I superimpose the logical digits on this famous introduction of John's prologue. All right, and it turns out it works very nicely. In the beginning was the Word. Well, that's an easy one if you look at the ethics index. Right? The Word is the category of faith. It's associated with the Son, Trinitarian-wise, with the understanding. The Word was with God. The withness, and this is the novelty in the thinking now occurring logically. Right? What's new logically? In other words, if you just pick up all these crazy digits and the rules for operating on them and had no reference to Christianity, God, you name it. Whatever's new in this, what I call real trinary logic, is that the third digit, in this case the unum, and the one that comes in addition to 1 and 0, in bool and in pers, this third digit, and the one that's there where we find in quantum mechanics something like it, namely a circle or a 0 with a 1 in it, contained in it, right? 0 and 1 superimposed on one another, providing me with a state of indeterminacy. You see, a state of perfect coherence in quantum mechanics. The unum in thinking now occurring is different from both traditional straight binary logic and the binary trilogy in Peirce and in quantum mechanics. They're variations on the same idea. Insofar as the third digit in the real trinary logic is the equal of both of the others. It's not the intermediary, and it's not simply a consequence of the superimposition of the one of those on the other. Because, and I can prove it logically, you see, 3 zeros equals unum. So I don't even need a 1 to get unum. So unum has a kind of equality with 0 and unum in the logic. So the point I'm making is, what's new in the real trinary logic is that term that in one way relates 0 and unum. It's the middle term, you see, logically. But unlike those other middles, it's the equal of the things that unites. That's the spirit, right? So when John says, in the beginning was the Word, we got the Son nailed down. When he says that the Word was with God, see, if I start thinking in terms of my yardstick, so, well, you know, he was in the room with him. There ain't no room. He was close to him. They were walking along next to him. You see? What does with mean here, you see? Well, it's got to have a meaning. Right? And we now have a clear understanding. He was unum God. You see? He, if we could translate unum as a verb, right? He was, or a preposition. So the withness, the being with of the Son and the Father is the Spirit. That's classic theology. I mean, we're not inventing the theology, you understand? We're saying that there is a logic to that theology which we need and now are able to make explicit. And of course, the Word was God, right? So here I'm taking the God as the Father, right? So the Word is the unbolded one. The Word is the 0. The with that relates that 0 to the God, the Father, who is the 1, is the unum. And then I read the next line, and at first it was a puzzle. He was with God in the beginning. And then it became very clear to me after a little bit of reflection. Right? So I translated it for you in logical terms on page 2 there, after the John 1:1, John 1:2. He, is what John says, was with God in the beginning. And the beginning now is the way we can understand. The beginning is the foundational beginning. You see, it is that beginning. Now, this is very important. The thinking now occurring. It's the fourthness, the bold one, which is equally, as it were, near to or far from. You see, it's almost irrelevant. You see, equally related to is the most neutral term I think I can come up with. 1, 2, and 3. The divine essence is equally the one essence of Father, Son, and Spirit. The beginning, the foundation, fourthness, is equally the foundation of whatever threesome you want to relate it to. So I want to put it more positively, and this is very relevant to the notion that for the first time, the imperative, the absolute imperative, is to create. It's to begin to existence. Right? Where begin to existence, or to begin to exist, I mean, the different ways of modulating that, right? Where to begin has, you know, in philosophy, I don't know if philosophy you pick up, philosophers often use the word exist as a transitive verb, to exist something. Do you see? I want to say, the thinking now occurring, the beginning, right, is in that sense transitive. The beginning is not in the past, and the beginning is not in the future. The beginning, like fourthness, is everywhere, right? So it's, as it were, the divine essence is that absolute, for want of a better term, again, beginningness, right? See? Okay, and John's got it all, he's got it locked up. We could quit there. He could go home too. You see? He said it all. You want to talk about pithy, succinct, that's it. That's all you need to know. Okay? Now, of course, we're perverse, so we want to know more. So John is going to oblige us. Okay? But there we have the whole story in 2 verses, 4 lines. Through him, because, so the way I would put it is that in a sense, and I have to be careful here, in a sense, what follows is implicit there. You see, if you really understand that, then as it were, I have to be careful, as it were, well, of course, the Word becomes flesh. Of course, the ultimate upshot is to turn the creation away from sin toward its original, again, bad word, toward its being coming to be divine. You see, all of that is implicit in that structure. So through him, all things came into being. Not one thing came into being except through him. What has come into being in him was life, life that was the light of men, and light shines in darkness, and darkness could not overpower it. All right, and then there's a quibble that goes on in exegesis as to how overcome should be understood, because it can be translated understand, and it can be translated as overcome. Okay, but that tells you something right there. See, it tells you something right there, that our understanding of understanding has been a matter of overcoming something, of controlling something, of, you see, of being on top of it. I'm going to jump ahead to make the point a little more broadly. In one of the notes here, as much as I like the notes in this text, there's a reference which comes in our reading today, if we ever get to it. There's a reference to the divine sovereignty. Hey, I just finished writing a text that says beyond sovereignty. What are you talking about? You see? So, what is the kingship of God mean? What does King of Israel mean? You see? What does divine sovereignty mean here? Well, we got a clue when we get further into the New Testament, where Jesus says to Pilate or somebody, "My kingdom is not of this world." Now, what does that mean? You see? It bears thought. But we can say right for openness, you see, my kingdom is not of this world. It's not of the schema of this world, as Paul would put it, right? It's not what you understand by sovereignty is not what I can understand, because here we have a king whose power is to let go, whose power is not to overpower, right? In other words, you say, go back here, right? The darkness didn't overpower it, didn't understand it, but the sovereignty that's at stake here blows up our whole understanding of sovereignty. If we mean by sovereignty, as I articulated, draw it out in Beyond Sovereignty, coming from super, Latin, super annus etas, the state, annus of belonging, super, to the class of the above, right? And as I point out in my critique of Agamben, if you belong to the class of the above, you can't have any company, because then you ain't super. You know, right? Super guys, they don't stay in a room too long. Stalin and Hitler, they signed a pact, but you would have to know that it couldn't last. Okay, all right. 2 guys who are out to rule the world, it's not possible. Jesus' version of this is you can't serve 2 masters. He's smart. He's got. Okay. So all right. You see what I'm saying? So sovereignty. If we mean by sovereignty the class to which only one can belong, therefore a notion of unity that excludes multiplicity. I mean, you want to talk about exclude? There's nothing that excludes the notion, ontologically and logically, of multiplicity like sovereignty. That's it. You see? So we can't be so I know when they write the notes, they're not doing, they're not giving a course like this. It's not their job. But, right? They're just writing notes. Okay, but when you start to deal with the text, you're going to have no basis for any notion of sovereignty as the etymology of the word would seem to indicate. right?
Yeah, it doesn't appear in the text. It doesn't, right?
No, I don't think it does.
Yeah.
I don't think so. But it's ambiguous because lordship, Lord, that kind of thing appears, right? And kingdom does appear. Jesus comes to announce the kingdom. So now we have to ask, what do we mean by kingdom? Right? Now he, as I said, he makes it clear. Whatever we mean by kingdom is not what we mean in this world, that's, to use his language, by kingdom. All right. Okay. Well, I don't want to get off too far on that. All right. So skipping the next paragraph, John, he explains who he is. He's coming to bear witness to the light. And then dropping down to 1:9, the Word was the real light, the true light in the Greek, that gives light to everyone. He was coming into the world. He was in the world that had come into being through him. Now you see what it would be a problem if containers worked here? If the world's coming into being through the Word, was that here's an arena, and if you want to come into being, you have to come in within the boundaries of this thing, and then you got this thing coming in, getting contained in that which came into being through it. I mean, I'm already a pretzel, okay? So, I mean, I don't think you have to be a genius to realize that this is not you can't think, I mean, if this is thinking, no wonder Luther said reason is a crock, because if you were reasoned about it in a traditional way, it doesn't work. It's absolutely incompatible. Right? That's why Thomas said, not quite so radically as Luther, don't try and prove that the world was created ex nihilo. Right? Because both of them, to different extremes, had a notion of reason which is very understandable historically, you see, but which is now passé. Right? Who said we have to have containers inside and outside? Okay. So he came into the world. So what does it mean to come into the world? See, so I'm cheating you. I didn't even do this at home. It means he got himself embodied in the world. You see? I was thinking about this go back to my hamburger analogy. You see, I think that when I eat the hamburger, I embody it in some sense. It's ambiguous language, right? I mean, it becomes part of me. Right? This is Hegel's view. The hamburger is food. What is food? Food is stuff that's meant to be eaten. So when I consume the food in Hegel, that's the truth of the food. The food comes into its own. Now what it was meant to be, fuel for my being. Right? So I have embodied it. But now when I think about it, I've said this before in different contexts, wait a minute. I think I'm eating the world. Right? I'm embodying the world in part. But actually what? I'm breathing. I mean, in other words, I am embodied in the world. I am. So you asked about body before. The basic notion of thinking now occurring, I don't know whether cosmology is the right word here, but what would be cosmology and thinking now occurring is that the world is a body. It's the body of Christ. But the body of Christ is not a container. So if the body which embodies everything else that is embodied in it is not a container, then it's not a container of things that are not containers. Bodies that are not containers, yeah.
Could you say something about the Eucharist in that? Just about
Well, it's going to come up.
Okay.
The short. I think I know what your question is, or at least the relevance of it. When the Eucharist is, you're consuming what is understood to be, believed to be, the body and blood of Jesus. Body, blood, soul, and divinity is the elaborate way of putting it to make sure it's perfectly clear. Not a corpse, in other words, and not just a human living, right, but a living human who is divine person. The notion in communion, Eucharist, is theologically is that I eat the host, but in doing that, my pedestrian mind, like I eat the hamburger, I think the hamburger's becoming me, turns into me. The nutritious parts of it, the rest go out down the drain, right? The theological notion, which is more to the point here, is that when I receive communion, I am transformed into Christ. My consuming the host is my being consumed by the host. A better way of putting it in thinking now occurring terms is that when I embody the host, when I embody the body and blood of Jesus, the body and blood of Jesus embodies me. That's what's going on. I heard a guy at a First Communion service for kids, little kids, First Communion, and a priest, and I thought it was excellent theology, and but it was put in the most everyday terms for the audience. He said when he was a little kid, he loved hot dogs. And he ate hot dogs. You gave him hot dogs, he had one after another. And he said, remember, his mother said to him, if you keep doing that, you keep eating hot dogs, you're going to turn into a hot dog. And then he made the point, the theological point. When you eat the Eucharist, you turn into Christ. Right? So it may not be. I don't know. It may also be true in the case of hot dogs. I don't know. But anyway, but I think that's relevant to where you were driving at. He came to his own people did not accept him. And then you could read that the note says probably the Jews. You could say humanity, because it would be true on both levels. But to those who did accept him, he gave power to become children of God, to those who believed in his name, who were born not of human stock or human desire or human will, but from God himself. What I want to say there is, we're going to elaborate on this further, but in other words, the key thing, first of all, it's from God himself, all right? So one is born from God himself, somehow or other born from the Father or the Spirit later on, depending on the particular context, or in the other language that Jesus is going to use more specifically later on, those who are drawn to him by the Father, all right? So in other words, to be born from above in the dialogue with Nicodemus is a spiritual birth, which is something that happens because of divine initiative. Here's where Luther put all his money on this. Right? Luther, he brought everything down to the moral. What's this to me? One absolute simplification, and the other absolute simplification. We got the whole debate. By the way, the Lutherans and the Catholics finally resolved this about 10 years ago. They said, it's all a misunderstanding. It's amazing. It was a real misunderstanding, though. But what Luther insisted on absolutely, so to speak, like faith alone, was that the corollary of faith alone was that no one could have faith unless the Spirit gave him that faith, right? And there's good textual justification for that, right? So he wanted to exclude any other influence but the acting of the Spirit or the Father, right? In order to make one ready to accept the incarnate word, the truth of what Jesus is saying, right? But the point being, therefore, that faith is fundamental, right? And you go back to the index of simplicity, the zero moment, which is the moment here of the incarnation and the crucifixion, is the moment of faith. But that faith is the doing of the Father, or the doing of the Spirit, depending on the context. All right. The Word became flesh, which is the major issue here, right? All right. The incarnation. He lived among us, and we saw his glory, the glory that he has from the Father, as the only Son of the Father. And again, the glory he has from the Father, all right? Full of grace and truth.
Could you say something about the word glory? First of all, what is it in Greek? What's the...
Doxa. And it's a word that has many connotations. Did you ever get that into linear?
Yeah, it's what I wanted was the Greek text.
Yeah.
So it was.
It has the Greek text at the bottom.
It was English with
It has the Greek under it, and then at the bottom of the page it has the full Greek text.
Yeah.
But the great thing about that, I got it since you provoked me.
It had some pages missing, so I sent it back. So
oh, well, okay. Well, when you get the one with the pages in it, the Greek terms have numbers that in the back will give you you'll get the Greek on the page, but in the back it'll give you the meanings of the word. The case of doxa is a very interesting word. It means opinion, but in the context of glory, it's also translated sometimes in this text too. Sometimes glory, sometimes honor. So opinion in the sense of a good opinion of you. You see? So if I glorify you before men, I, in effect, speak well of you, right? Or I act in such a way that redounds to your honor, like the antithesis of disgrace. You see? So something along those lines. Now, of course, it's very interesting intellectually because it's the word that Plato uses when he talks about that which is not knowledge. Right? It's what appears. So glory also has a visual thing in English too, right? Glory is light. The glorious day, bright, clear, to see. So where Plato looked at glory in Greek, doxa, he saw it in the negative. He saw it as an appearance, as not the real light. You see, not the real. Not what you were, I guess you could almost say, not the real honor of reality.
And what you don't know, you only opine.
Yes, that's right. But no, in the New Testament it has a much more affirmative meaning. It doesn't have that meaning because I don't think the New Testament is Platonic in any sense of the word, right? We remember, the reason why this thing is bound this way is not accidental. Right? As the marginal notes indicate, that if you want to go deep, we can't do everything. We just can't even lay a glove on that. But it's there. In other words, this takes place in the context of the Old Testament. Jesus is understands himself to be, and is understood by his disciples to be the fulfillment of the promises of the Old Testament, the fundamental promise of the Messiah. He's it. Okay? Well, he's unintelligible apart from the first 1,500 pages, you see, right? Okay, so in that context, we're not dealing with Platonism because we're already dealing in a context in which God has been going, for many centuries, has been involving himself in human affairs. Now, he has never gone to the point, and was never expected to go to the point, you see, of actually becoming human. I mean, that's too much, okay? But short of becoming human, he was on the scene quite frequently and directing, orchestrating events and so forth and so on, you see? Now, I want to suggest, now that I've said that came out of my mouth, as soon as I say that, then I want to say, well, now, when God goes too far, right? When we get the straw that breaks the camel's back, you see? The back that's broken is not only that for omnipotence, becoming a creature cannot be an impediment, now that I think about it. But now I would have never the occasion to think that. Although this is Kierkegaard's point, right? He tells this interesting story in Philosophical Fragments, but of course, no one would come up with such a. Where would you come up with such a story? It doesn't make any sense. It's contrary to reason. It's contrary to our self-understanding. That's where Kierkegaard is coming from, right? But if I've got a text which he's paraphrasing in the Philosophical Fragments that tells me, you see, that God became a human being, that the Creator became a creature. Well, if I just start with that text, what I'm saying now is, well, if the straw that breaks the camel's back is that what is inconceivable happens, then if the inconceivable involves the Creator becoming a creature, I think I'm going to lose my thought. That's terrible. It's too important.
When God goes too far.
Yeah. When he breaks that barrier, so to speak, there's another barrier he breaks, and I've lost the train of thought. It'll come back to me, I'm sure. So let's just hold it there. Okay. On the handout, I have some further notes on page 2, which I think is as good a time as any to allow. Well, no, it isn't, because we're running out of time. All right. I think we'll stop because we're pushing the clock. As usual, we'll catch up next time. Well, at least we've gotten the preliminaries out of the way for the most part. Read through to finish this gospel, and we'll pick up from here and go through If I remember I'm sure I will eventually remember the other piece of my thought. I may put it on the question and answer forum, not wanting to wait till next week to tell you what it was.
Now, how do we get into that again?
You put in your